Reading is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. Today's poem, the next in our series of bad poems by good poets, is taken from the work of Matthew Arnold. And Matthew Arnold I've had reference to before in this podcast. Matthew Arnold is usually listed as one of the principal poets of the Victorian era, and that's kind of an interesting fact in his case because poetry was not the trade, the task he set most of his life and energies to. Matthew Arnold was a man of letters who wrote a lot about art criticism, about religion. He wrote a couple books of biblical interpretation. He wrote problems with the current state of things sort of books. One influential book he wrote was called Culture and Anarchy, which is an attack on the social ugliness produced by certain types of industrial civilization of the kind that he saw much of in England in his day. So Culture and Anarchy is probably his best known book. He also wrote 3 collections of poetry. None of them was a great seller in its day. So he was a poet amongst other things. He was also a inspector of schools. It was his job to go around. This sounds like I understand the value of it. It's good to know what children are actually learning in public or private education, but to go around and evaluate test scores and see, literacy and, which students are learning to read at an appropriate rate, which students are learning their mathematics, their times tables, and going from town to town, school district to school district. And that was his job. So Matthew Arnold, there's perhaps a explanation there of why he didn't get much poetry written. He had a lot of other things. He was also a family man. He was married. He had children. He came actually from an interesting, network or family alliance of big Victorian intellectual families, because he was himself the son of Thomas Arnold, the founder and the great schoolmaster of Rugby School, which was one of the leading British public schools of the time, and famously commemorated in Tom Brown's School Days. That was Matthew Arnold's father. And he was also related by marriage to the Huxleys. So if you know Aldous Huxley was one of the great, probably the best known name in the Huxley family, who were mostly scientists. Thomas Huxley was a popularizer of Darwinian biology and known popularly in the press as Darwin's bulldog. So the Huxleys, the Arnolds, all these people are connected. Interesting family gatherings, I'm sure. All right, so the poem I chose for today is one that Arnold wrote entitled To a Republican Friend. He's writing this in the middle of the 19th century, not too far away from the great year of revolutions. It was called 1848, when there are liberal Republican revolutions all throughout Europe, not in England, but in virtually every other major European country, most of the German states, Italy, France, the Austrian Empire. You have revolutions of one sort or another, most of which are unsuccessful. But there is this feeling that monarchs, though they might sit on their thrones still, they're not necessarily there so securely as before. So Arnold here is writing a sonnet commenting on the ferment and the uproar and the shouting and the tumult of the moment that he is living through, expressing some sympathies for a friend who is caught up in the midst of these things, whose politics we are given to understand Arnold shares partially the idealism, but not perhaps completely. Arnold was not a revolutionary himself, but he has sympathy for people who want to man the barricades. All right, so this is an idealistic poem. I think there's real feeling in it. It fails, I think, mainly because of one line. So, To a Republican Friend by Matthew Arnold. God knows it, I am with you. If to prize those virtues, prized and practiced by too few, but prized, but loved, but eminent in you, man's fundamental life, if to despise the barren optimistic sophistries of comfortable moles, whom what they do teaches the limit of the just and true, and for such doing have no need of eyes, if sadness at the long heart-wasting show wherein earth's great ones are disquieted, if thoughts not idle, while before me flow the armies of the homeless and unfed, if these are yours, if this is what you are, then am I yours, and what you feel I share. All right, so this is a very, what can we say, a very earnest poem. It's a outstandingly high-minded sort of performance. It's in the sonnet form. It's another example. We had one earlier with Milton, an example of a sonnet that is not a love poem. It's a poem of public spirit. Arnold, a lot of his poetry is aimed at offering commentary and interpretation on the social difficulties of the times he and his contemporaries are living through, and that's fine. I mean, poetry can comment on and interpret practically any side of human experience, the social and political as well as the personal. That's not a problem. I think this is a poem, I think, which sort of trips in a prairie dog hole. It's running along gracefully, and then there's that, well, it's more than one line. It overlaps into two. The barren, optimistic sophistries of comfortable moles. So he's offering a criticism, by the way, of people who, in a kind of falsely, what does he say, falsely optimistic spirit, always expect, for shallow and unfounded reasons, everything will come right in the end without any great effort on our part. So the sort of person who looks out, says, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, and perhaps most importantly of all, I am comfortable, and goes on with his life without caring about the estate of his neighbor, the sufferings of his fellow man. Comfortable moles, though. I mean, it seems, I don't know if that quite works, because he's describing smugness. He's describing a recognizable type of human smugness, which you could, I suppose, if you wanted to, relate to some animal, if that helped illustrate it and help us see this type of person more clearly by means of a simile, by means of a metaphor. I don't think he accomplishes it, though, because when we think of smugness, um, in what way do moles, either physically or in any other sense, personify that? I mean, we can talk about, there are animals which are poetically associated with certain qualities, certain human qualities, like, a lion with royalty, a fox with craftiness, but are moles somehow poetically or in fable or in some sort of folk tradition associated with smug, self-comfort? I don't know that they are. I've never encountered that. And it's one of those moments that makes you pause in a poem, not because of the virtuosity of some metaphor or simile or turn of phrase, but almost through bewilderment. It's a bewildering image, and I just don't think it succeeds in what Matthew Arnold means for it to succeed in. So, other than that, I don't think this is a terrible poem, but I think that particular line and a half is kind of a fly in the ointment. So I'll read it one more time. To a Republican Friend by Matthew Arnold. God knows it, I am with you. If to prize those virtues, prized and practiced by too few, but prized, but loved, but eminent in you, man's fundamental life, if to despise the barren optimistic sophistries of comfortable moles, whom what they do teaches the limit of the just and true, and for such doing have no need of eyes, if these are yours, if this is what you are, then am I yours, and what you feel I share. All right, so this is a very but prized, but loved, but eminent in you, man's fundamental life. If to despise the baron's optimistic sophistries of comfortable moles, whom what they do teaches the limit of the just and true, and for such doing have no need of eyes. If sadness at the long heart-wasting show wherein earth's great ones are disquieted, if thoughts not idle, while before me flow the armies of the homeless and unfed, if these are yours, if this is what you are, then am I yours, and what you feel, I share. This has been the Well-Read Poem. Thank you very much for listening.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron-supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.